Please welcome to the stage Rob Nelson from Sia Partners.
All right. I hope you didn't miss me too much. I was gone for all of 2 minutes. I'd like to welcome up to the stage. We're going to do a quick Q&A panel and talk through some of these things in a little bit more detail with folks that are very well embedded in the industry. I'd like to welcome up Davina, Jordan, David, and Chris. Come on up.
Hi.
It's very bright. I'm so sorry.
Very bright.
So before we get started, I've got a few questions, and you guys watched the talk just now. But I'd love for you each to give a quick introduction for yourselves. And I believe we've got an individual that is not going to be here, but is through the magic of, there he is. So we'll give a quick introduction, starting with our good friend in the infinite void up there.
Yeah, how's it going? I'm Chris Cheatham. This is the first time I've ever done a hybrid like this. I'm kind of pretending that I'm in the metaverse a little bit while I'm doing this. So anyways, I'm the product evangelist at Bold Penguin. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Yeah, so thanks, Robert. Thank you, guys. My name is David Gurley. Prior to the role that I'm in now, I actually spent 20 years with Merrill Lynch and Bank of America on the wealth management space. So all in advisory, as an advisor, as a local leader here in Charlotte, but also as a North Carolina market leader in our private bank. My current role is I actually get the chance to work with advisors across different firms in a really unregulated format, but working on two things. One is how do we scale up, and number two is how do we maintain intimacy within the wealth management space. And it's really those two words, intimacy and scale, that led me to talk to Sia Partners and about the metaverse as thought leaders in that space. I wanted to see where we might be going, and it's been real. Thanks for having me.
Great. Jordan Teel, I'm the CEO of Everly. Previous to that, most of my career, almost actually all my career, was with MetLife/Brighthouse, who is a sponsor here somewhere. So I held many different roles, from financial planner, marketing, technology, wholesaling, operations, strategic, and then most recently was in digital sales, and then most recently, about a month ago, took the role of CEO at Everly. Happy to be here.
Davina Dumlin, I'm a manager at Sia Partners. I started my career in retail banking, financial advisory, then moved on to insurance advisory, and currently working a lot on UX UI design in the metaverse together with Rob.
Awesome. Well, you guys saw the presentation, and I think we went through a ton of use cases, right? Things that are going to be relevant, I think, for folks in this audience. But one of the first questions I had is related to the pandemic, and I wanted to give this one first to Chris. The metaverse kind of came into fashion as remote work became a requirement, right? We all had to stop what we were doing in our day jobs and figure out how we were going to survive away from the workplace. What I'm curious about is, do you think the metaverse is actually going to wane in popularity now that we think the COVID-19 risk is subsided and we're all getting back to work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it kind of reminds me of someone I know who actually purchased like a metaverse-esque office, like virtual setting for their company, and then got in a bunch of trouble for spending money on that. Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of tension right now between managers and employees, and wanting them back in the office versus maybe we need to do a remote work thing. And like, I think something that people tried to band-aid the whole situation with was a metaverse solution that maybe wasn't fully thought out. So I think you're going to see, it's like the innovation curve, right? Where you have their peak expectations and then you hit the trough of despair. I think at some point you're going to hit the trough of despair with all the metaverse stuff, where everyone's going to be like, this is not working. You're kind of hitting that right now with some of the examples we'll talk about. And then we'll figure out how it actually works. And so I think we're kind of somewhere in that space.
100% agree with that, actually. I think, talking to my customers, there was a lot of speculation about what they could do. And there wasn't a lot of time to think it through, right? So it was just kind of throwing it out there and hoping that it would work as best it could. But in some ways, maybe detracted from the overall experience and the perception that solution would be viable, right? Even though there's clearly shortcuts in terms of the development cycle and that kind of thing. I don't know, David, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we as humans, I mean, just take this event and, as a good example, is it a fist pump? Is it a handshake? Do I sit at 6 feet away at a table? I mean, there's this period of time we're working through it, but we as humans need this interaction, just like us in the office yesterday. But on the flip side, I look back at, 2020, I took 200 advisors plus the support staff to a fully remote state. We spent the money on technology, we spent the money on training. To some degree, the toothpaste is out of the tube, if you will.
Yeah.
And it's going to be hard to put it all back in. And as we talk about metaverse versus, Zoom or WebEx or whatever the VR part of the world is, I do think there's going to be a growing voice for intimacy in sort of a virtual space.
Right. And it's funny, in the conversation previous to this, the fireside chat, there was again the analogy of the pendulum.
Yep.
Right, swinging back and forth between wanting to have that in-person experience versus the convenience of being at home. And I think people, naturally crave both, right? Like they want to have that convenience, but they also want to have the interaction. We're social beings at the end of the day, right? And that pendulum continues to swing. And I think you said it really well, which is there's that middle ground, and I love that. I think that's a super critical, piece to enabling us, to have our cake and eat it too, essentially, right? When it comes to
just over the last 2 years, I mean, people in the room, I mean, your companies, I don't know about you, but I'm guessing, it could be 20 or 30% of turnover, of sort of new people, others have left, have never met one another. So that's part of the reason why employers want you back in the office is just to meet your coworkers, and then, like I said, we'll eventually fall back into, what makes sense for our business.
Yeah, for sure.
I think as well from a design perspective, going into the metaverse, everything was really rushed. People just looked at all the different solutions out there and they're like, metaverse seems like something we can do. Yeah. But then, you have developers, you have designers, they're like, oh, wait a minute. So they're quickly put something together. And then I think it's also like a positive because from that, we've learned what not to do mainly and how we can move forward. And I think especially for starters, junior people at the start of their career, this can be really helpful because there's only so much you can learn in a 30-minute Zoom call. You sit there, you listen, you write a couple of points down, and you make a report. But the interaction in the office, the networking that you have, and opportunities, learning passively from watching other people or hearing other people, how they do their job, I think that is something that we can emulate much better in the metaverse. Now that we've had the bad experiences, we can see how we can improve upon them and how we can move forward.
Certainly. So that's a great segue to the next question. That wasn't planned, by the way. So there's a lot of barriers. You mentioned development, right? But there's a ton of barriers to adoption, right? Beyond just developing the experience, right? There's things like, what is the culture? I talked a little bit about that earlier. Developing something that's, culturally appropriate for my business. What's the process? And then, to your point, do I have the technological muscle to be able to actually deliver something like that within my organization? Jordan, I'm wondering, what do you see as some of the main barriers from your experience?
Yeah, I usually bucket them into kind of 3 different areas. What are the barriers for the technology? What are the barriers from the human side? And then the one that we don't want to talk about, what are the barriers from the regulatory side?
Right.
We'll take them in order, and I'll spend the least amount of time on the last one. So the technology barriers to me are really about access and connectivity. So the access to it is so limited because of the infrastructure, and there was even a question earlier about the infrastructure necessary to access the metaverse or VR or AR. So the ability to actually produce an infrastructure that more and more people can actually get into the said metaverse is going to be a limitation. Now, I think it's going to be the fastest one to go away. As demand increases, technology expands much faster. But then connectivity, I think, is going to be the harder one to figure out. So I think we liken this to the World Wide Web, and you and I have had this conversation, but the World Wide Web was open source. This is inherently closed. So all of us are creating our own versions of the metaverse, and the question becomes, how are they going to interact with each other? Or do I expect your metaverse consumers to go to you and then jump to mine, or is there a transition in place? And I don't think we've really figured that out yet because they've been being built in these walled gardens. So I think those are the 2 biggest limitations from a technology standpoint. I think the more interesting one, because those can be solved, is the human side of this and the adoption of creating this unbelievably textured 3-dimensional world that's a lot of cases, some people are just getting used to the digital linear world. I mean, some people are just now okay doing digital banking. So how much more adoption will it take and comfortability will it take to create this much more textured environment that you more dive into? And then what does that do to the human psyche? Like, how do they actually respond to that? Bifurcating those two worlds out when they go into the world and come out of the world. How do they actually transition those two worlds? I think is something we definitely have to be cognizant of. And I think that will kick off the last one, which I spend the least amount of time on, is the regulations. There's going to be regulations on the tech side. There's going to be regulations on the human side. You're wearing a biometric reader on your eyeballs. And I think the more money that gets invested into this, there's going to be more recognition that we need to start regulating things much more. And as we all know, that'll typically slow things down.
100%. And then one thing, I love that point, right? We want to enable people to have that experience more easily. But as we do that, like the compliance and regulatory concerns become greater because you have to get more of your own personal data to make it easier for you to get in the experience and validate that you are you, which I think is a really important point. So there's like this sort of self-consuming cycle that I think we're going to see. Chris, we're not ignoring you in the void there. I'm wondering if you've got some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a couple of thoughts. You mentioned proving that you are you. And one of the things that really turned me on to kind of Web3 world, which I put like the metaverse in, is like this idea of pseudo-anonymous identities, right? You don't necessarily have to be who you are in real life. And so where does that start playing into this? Like, I don't know, like it's kind of, I'm not sure how that fits in, but the other thing that I think about is like regulatory side of lead gen. Like when I think of insurance, lead gen is the lifeblood of the industry. How are you getting people to look at your insurance product and potentially buy it? And like Web 2, like insurance moved into lead gen on the internet. So like, what's it going to look like in the metaverse, right? Until like that's when insurance companies, frankly, will get really interested, is when they can start making money off of this, not when they can start empowering their workforce. Like I used to run a back office insurtech solution called Risk Genius. And it was always hard getting people to pay attention because they didn't have budget because it didn't make them money to be better in the back office. And so I'm really curious how this starts getting embedded on the kind of lead gen, getting eyeballs on things side of things.
And I love the point you made around anonymity because there is the question I think in the mind of a lot of the sales force, which is, if I don't know that you're actually a customer, is it really worth my time to try to make the sales motion, right? There's that whole aspect of it. I think there's a cultural sort of, not a war, but definitely a differing of opinion right now within the Web3 community and even within the metaverse, right? Of kind of, what are the values there? Are we talking about a place where you can anonymously kind of do what you want to do, or is it going to be tethered to some sort of identity? And certainly the internet of that we're all familiar with has that same sort of corollary, right? Like, there's different forums where people can express their views anonymously or not. And it's interesting how people's behavior changes when they get to be anonymous versus not. Are they really going to be engaged as part of that sales cycle? I think that's a fantastic point, so thank you for making it.
I don't know, at the same time, the cover of anonymity can also help someone to explore more. And also admit that they don't know someone, it's embarrassing. Especially, I think, for younger people, the financial world, banking, most people know how that works. Credit, you were exposed to it pretty early on in your life. Insurance is a very different story. Most of us don't really know when we buy a car, you have to buy insurance, but what does everything mean? What does it mean to be insured? What am I covered for, what not, what's liable, what's not? So I think that's a very difficult thing to step into because it's a very complex product. This can help people as well as a barrier to overcome and to help ask the questions that they wouldn't maybe not ask because they're embarrassed, like, am I asking a stupid question here or not? So that might also help them. And in addition to what you said about the experience, you can actually put people through it. It's sort of to what you said earlier about the shock. Right. You can simulate a car accident, for instance, and what does that do to your car? Like, what's the process of having an insurance, like hitting someone else? How do you fill in the papers? Those are really simple things, but the first time, most people in the first year that they drive, they will at some point have an accident, like a small bump. And then you're standing there at the side of the road, you're 17, 16, 18. The first thing you do is call your mom or dad, like, hey, how do I do this?
I vividly remember that phone call.
So I think, going through that in a metaverse where you can ask questions that maybe you would be embarrassed to ask otherwise could be something that can help actually improve the experience overall when it happens in real life.
Yeah, I love that point. And two, I love the fact that you're thinking about it from a use case perspective, right? There's no, necessarily bad approach here. It's like, what approach do you use for what context? So, maybe there are scenarios where I want to let the people I'm engaging remain anonymous, and maybe there's not. But then having that capability to sort of pivot and bring the right tool for the job, in a sense, from a technological standpoint, I think is key. So, moving on a little bit, I kind of want to understand a bit more about, within the industry itself. We're talking about InsurTech and FinServ. Like, from this panel, and Jordan, I guess I'll ask you, how well do you think industry understands the capability of the metaverse today?
Amongst friends. So I've told this joke many, many times, and it's unfortunately true, which is what makes it funny. Like, our industry is not exactly the arbiter of amazing innovation and disruption. We're typically a very slow follower, and I'm more in the insurance space. And we thought DocuSign was like a digital new age for us, right? And then COVID happened, and we had to go much, much faster. I don't think we fully understand the capabilities of what it is yet, because of some of the limitations we talked about before. And I think we have to start to figure out, is it more the adoption? Is it the consumer side? Is it helping educate a consumer? Or is it building a world for a consumer? Is it for employees and the things that we can actually do to create this distance? My company is completely dispersed around the country. We do not have an office. That's a perfect example of, instead of getting a building in New York, maybe we create a virtual office for us to collaborate in. So I think we're still, much like everyone else, trying to figure out what is it and the layers of it. And I told you this when we were coming up on stage. I think a lot of people don't fully understand what the metaverse is, right? It's still this very nuanced thing that we haven't quite figured out. And yet we've all experienced pieces of it in everyday life. And then the example I gave you is how I explained it to my dad. Is you've experienced AR and VR in your lives already for the last 20 or 30 years, because when you're watching football, that wonderful yellow line is AR. Like, we've been interacting with it, we just didn't realize it. And the question is, how much further do we have to interact with it for it to become real? But it's been in our world. We just haven't fully understood the ROI, to Chris's point, the ROI of how do we make smart investments to see a return.
Right. And I think what I've seen sort of, I can be a consumer of these services just as much as anyone else in this room, but there's experiences being developed for consumers, and some of them recently have been skewered, like not well received. And I find that disappointing to see, granted, firms taking risks and trying to build these things up, because we still are in that sort of exploration phase, right? Where people are ideating. They're trying to understand what things do and don't work. And I think what we'll see, over time, likely is going to be sort of a winnowing down of those as the capability to build those experiences more robustly becomes mature in those organizations.
I think what I'm most excited about is the access to so much more data. It amplifies the data to where I think our original assessment is we should recreate what's in the real world in the virtual world, and we see efficiencies if we do that. And I think that's a little bit misguided. I agree we have to try those things, but I think it's more about listening to the community of what maybe new we've never thought about that we should be layering into their worlds. That doesn't exist in the physical world anywhere. And I think it's less about recreating what exists in this room, and it's more about listening to say what can be enhanced by the virtual world that maybe we couldn't even create in the physical world. I think will be the more interesting thing. So it's more about how you receive the data and then use the data. I think it's gonna be the more interesting part.
Yeah, 100%, right? There's all the data that the human race has ever compiled in one place, and now it's almost a daunting challenge. Yeah. How do we bring it to bear? So 100% agree. David.
Yeah.
You might have a hot read because you just experienced the metaverse recently. I'm wondering if you have a take on if the industry really understands what it's capable of.
Yeah, I mean, again, I came from a luxury of riches, sort of in terms of technology. So it's certainly there, but again, I don't want to sort of focus on what the consumer aspect of it as much as what else can we use it for. So it's pervasive in leadership development already, certain types of training. I even look at what, our D&I teams are doing in diversity and inclusion, and how can the metaverse help, remove certain biases that exist. And so it's there, the technology's there. It's sort of waiting for what problem it can solve and how fast. But I think you've got to look at just sort of the tech side of the business and who their customer is. And right now, their customer is LD, it's HR, it's those versus the field and consumers.
I love the point, the D&I point too. There's a lot of really interesting work and honestly terrifying work, because you can build whatever world you want, right? I could build you a terrible experience where you feel discriminated all day long. And you could know exactly what that feels like for a period of, or at least 80% of what that feels like, maybe because it's, you can take off those glasses, it's going to go away. But, certainly to generate empathy within, other groups, I think is super critical. We didn't go into a ton of that in this conversation today, but I think that's a key point, is there's not, anything blocking us from having whatever type of experience we want in the metaverse. Like the cost is marginal to do that, which I think is...
Well, I hope you have a really long line out at, to try this, because you allowed me to come into your office and try it yesterday, and I've got some experience, as an athlete. I've done some things on Zwift. I've made my Zwift room as immersive as possible. And obviously, we've got a lot of experience on Zoom, as Chris is today, or WebEx. But if you go and you put on, these glasses and you got your hands there, I mean, it changes. It's almost as though walking into this room, you feel emotional. You're like, okay, what do I think? What do I look like? I mean, all of these things, none of it takes place in Zoom, right? I mean, I know I got my work shirt still sitting in my gym shorts. Right. I probably got ready for the meeting 2 minutes ago versus having a drive in here, rain, where do I park? All this prep time, but it becomes emotional when you put these glasses on. You feel immersed. And that's the only way I could describe it. And I hope, again, everybody gets a chance to try that over the next couple of days. Because, again, it's not what you see. First of all, it's a very empty office, but it's how you feel. And I think that's where I want you to go as far as the metaverse goes. How did you feel when you were immersed in this office? You might feel a little dizzy, but you get over it quickly. But how did you feel? Your people are looking at you. What are you saying? What am I wearing? I wanted to take a selfie just to see what I look like. I look a lot like Robert.
Yeah, as it turns out.
But
I might have designed your avatar.
Yeah, but again, to me, it really was an immersive experience where I had emotion take over versus cool technology, the game side of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's something very common, like when we work with clients or people in general, when we put them into the environment, we've learned from experience to not do anything for the first 10 to 15 minutes and just let people look around, explore, walk around, because it takes a while to adjust. But I love your question about diversity. It does raise sort of the question of the ethics of the metaverse. How far can you go into putting people in uncomfortable positions? You can simulate an accident. There's nothing going to happen to you. You're not going to feel any physical discomfort, but deep psychological or emotional discomfort that you can feel, that's a completely new question. And especially with our enhanced attention to, mental well-being, mental health, it raises some interesting things.
Yeah, and
what are we going to do?
When it comes to we're talking about boo to buy a little bit, right? Where I can show your house just flying apart in a hurricane, right? Is that ethical, right? Is that something that I really want to subject my customers to? I would argue that in that case, yeah, because I want to save you from the tragedy that happens after the hurricane, but there's going to be other manipulation that I can do. And I think, there's an ethical piece here that I would be remiss to not point out, that everyone needs to keep in mind as they're sort of building these solutions, and we're all sort of in this new territory. Compliance is always very slow to keep up with the pace of technology, and so, as arbiters of our own environment, I think it behooves us to think of those things now or pay for it later, just as a personal
I'd love to hear
note.
Chris's point on this or take on this, because he's working at it from a distributor point of view. So,
yeah, I mean, I keep coming back to lead gen, because it's something I've learned from transitioning from my company to then getting acquired by Bold Penguin, and Bold Penguin has an exchange where leads are sold back and forth between companies, and how that gets embedded is going to matter a lot into the metaverse. And some very unethical things happen in lead world right now in Web 2. And I think it's going to be possibly just way worse in Web 3 or metaverse, right? Can you imagine the manipulation you're going to be able to do on if I'm at my computer and I have an ad pop up for lead gen, essentially for InsurTech, that's one thing. But like, imagine, like, I'm thinking like Ready Player One type stuff that can start happening with insurance companies that want to make or not insurance companies, but the lead gen companies that want to get your attention in the metaverse where you're totally immersed. Like, why couldn't you simulate a hurricane and freak someone out and be like, now are you ready for hurricane insurance? Like things like that. It's just going to get really ugly, I think, at some point.
Right, especially at scale.
Yeah.
And that's a great segue to the, I want to focus now more on the consumer side of things as we're wrapping here. But you know, I'm curious, Chris, in your mind, is there any experiences that we should not pursue in the metaverse? Like, what is a bad use case for the metaverse?
Yeah, I think this is kind of, we were having a conversation earlier, and I saw the picture you had of the virtual bank, right? And like my initial visceral reaction was like, I don't want a virtual bank because I don't want to go into a regular bank. Like, I don't want anything to do with that. But like, then I started like kind of thinking about, all right, what would I actually want to do, right? Like I was thinking about, I tried to start a new bank account recently and had to enter information and I never heard back from that bank. And it's like one of the world's leading banks out there that's supposed to be doing digital stuff. So I'd much rather be able to like zoom in and talk to someone right away, you know, about starting that bank account. Or every time I go check my check registrar, right, I'm going into the website. That there's no reason like those can't be, that's the virtual bank, right? It's not me walking up to the virtual bank to talk to someone and deposit money to them like we think of those banks in the past. It's like every time you go to the website of your bank and do something, that's the virtual bank. And there's ways to make that a little bit more tangible and fun for people by doing it in the metaverse if done properly. But like thinking about people walking up to a virtual bank, I think that's where I was like, well, nothing to do with that. Does that make sense?
Right. So if I'm playing that back, it's a virtual bank that you don't really notice as much.
Yeah,
it's there.
right.
It's with you, and it's as unintrusive as possible. But you know, there's those times when I have to go in and sign a document, or I have to go in and actually have a conversation with a rep and understand a concept. And yeah, I think that's right. Trying to minimize the amount of consumer pain, right? At the same time, like, you know, being able to comply with the way the process should work.
Actually, real quick, I'm going to add one thing. Like, think about all the times I actually have to go into the bank. Those are the very first things I would want replaced by a virtual bank.
Right.
Right. That would be amazing.
And maybe that's it, right? Maybe that's the core of it is, you know, how do I make it so the you know, the virtual context of that bank is a value add. It's because I didn't have to get in my car and go drive there. And getting back to a point in the conversation we were having earlier is a question around environmental impact, right? There you go for FinServe, right? Is if I have more virtual banks, less brick and mortar, that's certainly beneficial to my overall footprint. I don't know, David, do you have a?
Yeah, I mean, in the advice world, I would suggest not using the metaverse for, you know, emotional discussions, right? So whether it's a, you know, something going on in the client's life or something that sort of, you know, requires empathy. Those are another one that I mentioned to you is you know, in the HR world, it's not good to go into the metaverse to let someone go and then move on to your next meeting. You know, you don't carry with that the emotion that should go with that decision. So I think, you know, as we look forward, it's got to be service-oriented items, you know, service in a, again, it's one step beyond my phone or one step beyond self-service. I think Chris is right. Those are the things we want to look at.
100%, yeah. I think, you know, another key aspect here is the way that we're engaging customers and thinking about the value chain for them. I think every comment I've heard so far touched on it, right? Is like, you know, am I going to save you time? I'm going to save you, a trip outdoors, something like that. When we're talking about education, though, when we're talking about customer education, I'm not sure that there's still a clear value chain there, especially with the metaverse. And I think it goes back to your point, David, on that consultative piece, right? There are certain aspects where I want to have, an individual talk me through something in person where it is emotional. And I don't know that in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of previews for what's coming, right? I don't know in my lifetime we'll ever get to a metaverse experience that's identical in every way to in person, like where, I wouldn't know the difference. I don't think we'll get there. I think we'll get close, but I don't know that we'll ever replace the good old-fashioned sit down with a client and let's have a talk. And I think that's maybe one of the most critical points to come away from this entire discussion with is that there's a time and place for the metaverse, but I don't think it's putting good old-fashioned boots on the ground out of business anytime soon.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we're at time. So I very much appreciate the panel here today. This has been fantastic, and Chris for coming in virtually. I don't think I've never done a virtual panelist before, so this hybrid approach is, I guess, our new normal. So thank you so much, and thanks everybody for listening to our talk today. You've been a great audience.